Our cool season vegetables are up and growing enough now that we're going to side dress them with the nitrogen fertilizer. And remember, this is nitrogen only, and it's the first number, and we're using ammonium nitrate. We talk a lot about slow release fertilizers. You can find a slow release nitrogen, but they're very costly. So this particular one we're using is water soluble, so it leaches real readily through the soil. So you want to be careful with the amount you're using and just side dress it in a band on top of the ground around your vegetables, such as your spinach and lettuce, the cole crops, things that are real leafy and use a lot of nitrogen. We're real pleased too with our cabbage and broccoli and Brussels sprouts. About last week we put on the BT and we mixed up the sugar and starch to help keep the BT on for a longer period of time, and it really appears to be working. We don't have any damage yet from the cabbage worm, and the only thing we're worried about now is keeping the deer out. So we still have some of our chicken wire covering up our cole crops to keep the deer from feeding on it. We'd like to show you some of our first harvest from our gardens too. We've got some of the radishes here that we planted among the cole crops to use all of our space. And then of course over here we planted our sugar peas, and we really had poor germination because we planted them a little bit too deep and the soil temperature was still kind of cool, but we also had a lot of humidity under it because we had the plastic over it to help protect from the cold nights. So we have some fungus diseases that got our peas, and here's one of the transplants that's still hanging in there, but there's no roots on it, so we went ahead and pulled it up, and again that's from the fungus disease with the wet, cool temperatures that we had. So we'll come back and we're right on the borderline of planting some more peas, but we can also come in with some of our warm season vegetables, which it is time to plant. You know, a lot of people are hesitant to raise vegetables because they think of the large vegetable acreages that most of the rural people have. But really that's not an excuse, because there are a lot of new varieties out on the market with names such as space-saving or miniature, dwarf, compact varieties that require less space and still give you a lot of production. But the key to it is to make sure that you read the seed packet or read the description in the catalog, because some of the miniatures may be miniature fruit, where a space-saving variety actually will be standard size fruit but on a smaller plant. And we're planting some of those in our garden here. And of course, we've got raised bed gardens that we've been using for several years on Oklahoma Gardening, and that's a space-saving idea in itself. But now we're putting in some varieties that take up a little bit less space too. We've already planted some of our stakeless tomatoes, and that's a variety that is determinate. And what that means is after so many nodes, the growth will stop and it won't get any taller, and you'll get a little bit more spacing and growth on the side branches. But we can control a lot of that too just by some pruning, which we'll talk about later on in the season. But we've got some stakeless plants that are about 2 feet apart, but we're going to plant some other things too. And one of the varieties here is Patio. And Patio is a variety of tomato that has been around for quite a while, but it is a determinate variety that can be grown in containers as well, but it still needs to be staked, where the ones beside it are Patio Prize, and they really do not require staking. So you want to make sure that you understand what you're getting and that you read the seed packet and find out what's going on. We've also got Better Bush that we're going to be planting over here. But of course, when we plant something, we need to make sure that we have fertilizer. And we have done a soil test, and we know that our soils are really pretty high in phosphorus and right on the margin for potassium. So we're going to incorporate a 16-4-8 fertilizer in the planting hole. And the reason that we're going to do that is because we won't waste fertilizer in areas that the plant's not going to be growing. And let me give you a little tip here, because a lot of times when we're measuring things, it might say use a cup or so many ounces and use a handful, and you need to really find out how much fertilizer your hand will hold. And so just take some fertilizer, drop it in a measuring cup, and my hand holds about 1/3 of a cup of fertilizer. So now I know that when I'm putting out applications, but we want to go ahead and measure that as well, and it comes out to about 4 ounces. Now, on some recommendations on fertilizer, that 4 to 5 ounces would be plenty to incorporate in this whole bed, which is about 50 feet. So you can see that's not a lot of fertilizer, and that tells us that many times we are over-fertilizing. But keep in mind that in intensive planting like this and with vegetables, the rates are a little bit higher because of the rapid herbaceous growth that we get. So we've got it measured out, and again, we're just going to put a couple of tablespoons in the planting hole, and that way the roots will grow through the fertilizer. And we want to put in some of our soil so those roots do not grow in contact with it. And we've got the Better Bush variety, which is another space-saving variety, and it will not need staking, and it's got pretty good sized fruit on it. And we'll just put that in our planting hole. And these transplants are a little bit young, but that's okay as long as you have them hardened off. And then a lot of times we have problems with cutworms even on transplants such as tomatoes. Usually they're more of a problem on our cold crops, but if you have a high population of them, you might want to check the tomatoes too. And a neat little cutworm collar is just to put a little bit of newspaper around the stem, and that will help keep those cutworms from cutting off the plant. Now you can also use a paper bag as well, and as the weathers, the paper will decompose, and it'll protect it during the time that the stem starts to harden up where it's not quite as susceptible. Now we also have peat pots that we can plant some of our transplants. Some of the times we can purchase them that way. And remember that the peat pot can be planted directly in there. You might want to loosen the bottom up a little bit to relieve where the roots can grow. And then the other thing is when you put it down, make sure that the top is peeled away and none of that is exposed, because it acts just like a wick and it will dry out the root system. So be careful to have that covered up or pull away some of the top of that peat pot. Now once we've got them planted, even though we've put in a fertilizer for later on in the growth, with transplants you want to have a tendency to go ahead and put a starter solution on. And so we'll water them in with the fertilizer, and you can see the blue color. That's just a water soluble or liquid fertilizer, and that will help get them started right off the first few weeks of growth until they can grow down and get that fertilizer we put in there. And then we'll monitor the plants and see if they need side dressing later on. Well, most of us have reached the point that we're past our frost-free date, but some of us in the panhandle in northern Oklahoma, it still may get a little cold or a chance of freezes at night. So you want to watch the weather, and we've got a water wall over here that is like a protective device that heats up the soil and will help the freezes from getting on your crop. So there's several things on the market. Make sure you watch the weather, because some of the parts of the state it's still a little questionable as to when to plant our warm season vegetables.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.